All right, everyone, please welcome our next guest, Miss Merida Kelly. Penn Jillette, the taller of the magician pair, announced. Merida walked out onto the stage, her eyes bright and smile wide, with her fiery hand billowing behind her like a wildfire. The audience gave her a round of applause as she moved to the center of the stage and offered them all a curtsy. Penn smiled at Merida. So, Merida, how long have you been performing magic? Merida smiled, her eyes full of amusement at the question. Too long to remember. Safe to say, all your life, then? Penn asked. Merida paused and thought about that one, then nodded cheekily. Safe to say, yes, sir. Teller, the short and silent member of the magician pair, tapped Penn's shoulder, then motioned to his wrist as if to remind him of the time. Penn nodded. My friend is telling me that we're short on time. Can't be shorter than me, Merida remarked with a grin. That brought a laugh from the audience. To say that she was petite would be an understatement. Merida was only 4.5 feet tall, and the joke was about as obvious as you could get. The fact that she was willing to make the joke and endure some self-deprecation to bring a smile to the crowd. Penn laughed along, playing his role as host to perfection. I suppose not, but we do need to get this show of yours started. So Merida, take it away. Merida put on a bright smile and looked out at the crowd as she produced a fresh pack of playing cards. As I said, I've been performing magic longer than I can remember. All my life, in fact. She shuffled the deck expertly, performing tricks with the cards, sending them flying through the air in a pair of arches to mix them up, flipping the decks and cutting it in dexterous displays. I've found that, while the mind-blowing tricks and spectacular visuals can be good entertainment, none of them are any substitute for the most simplistic of tricks that leave you wondering. How? She smiled. Like simple card tricks. She pointed at Penn and Teller. I know these two are probably a little disappointed right now, since I don't have any other props or distractions. But I can guarantee you this, if I had anything like that, they would be able to try and justify saying they figured this one out. The redhead began to place the cards face down on the floor in a simple row, then stepped back several feet. She motioned to the hosts. Sirs? You please turn out your coat and pants pockets, please. The pair looked at each other with a comically curious glance, then complied. They turned out their pockets to show that they were empty. Excellent, Merida nodded. Now, Mr. Teller, would you please approach the line of cards and choose one? Teller pointed at himself, looked around unsurely, then stood and approached the line. He mimed the line of cards once he'd come to it. Merida nodded. Precisely. Pick whichever one you want. Teller made a show of walking back and forth along the line of cards, mockingly pondering his decision as he tapped his finger to his chin. Finally, after a few moments, he stomped a foot down on one of the cards. Merida laughed and played along, gasping in shock. Pick it, not kick it. Pick it up and show Penn. Teller placed his hands to his chest as if upset that he'd been chided. He took the scuffed card and brought it back to Penn, showing him the card. They then showed the audience, and a few of the cameras, the card. The 3 of clubs. Don't tell me what the card is, Merida said, as the pair looked at the card. Once you have it committed to memory, Penn, please bring the card back and place it in its spot on the floor. Very well, Penn said with good humor. He stood and took the card from Teller, who played at being upset that it had been snatched from him. He knelt at the line of cards and placed the card back in its spot. Thank you, sir. Merida bowed her head. You can return to your seat now. Once Penn had returned to his seat, Merida began to pick up the cards. She didn't look at any of them as she put them all back together. She left the deck of cards on the floor and gave it a single tap of her fingers. She stood up and placed her hands behind her back. And there you have it. That's the trick. Penn and Teller looked at each other, then at the small red head. Were you going to guess the card, or do something to reveal it? Penn asked, as if there was something missing from the equation. Merida tipped her head to the side curiously, causing her fiery mane to curtain with the movement. Oh, no, I can't do that. The audience and the two other magicians all seemed confused. Pen's brow furrowed awkwardly. I know you've said you've been doing magic all your life, so you should know that every trick has to have a reveal. You haven't finished the trick. Well, that's because I can't show you the card, Merida replied, as if a teacher were asking her for homework she hadn't done. And why not? Pen asked. Merida pointed at Teller. Because he has it in his jacket's breast pocket. Pen looked at Teller, whose expression looked like he wasn't sure if he should believe Merida or not. He reached into his pocket and retrieved the scuffed 3 of clubs. He was so astonished that he dropped the card onto the small table that rested between Pen and himself. Pen picked card up and showed it to the audience and the cameras. The audience could only gasp. There were no cheers because the trick hadn't been bombastic. In fact, it had been so subtle that it didn't warrant any other reaction beyond sheer befuddlement. Well, sirs? Merida asked with a cheeky grin. Can you tell me how I did it? The two whispered to each other, making a show of deliberating between themselves. After Minute, Pen looked at Merida. We can't think of anything. It couldn't be sleight of hand because you never approached us. In fact, once the cards were on the floor, you moved even further away from us. Merida nodded. Correct. And you had us turn out our pockets to show they were empty, Pen continued. That might have been a feasible explanation, except that we weren't in on the act. True enough, Merida's smile widened. Teller leaned over and pointed to the back of the card, tapping it insistently. Pen nodded and swatted Teller's hand away. Okay, I was getting to that. The crowd was able to laugh finally at the pair's antics. And this is definitely the same card because it has Teller's shoe print on it. Pen flicked the back of the card and held it up to one of the cameras. You couldn't have known he would have done that, so you couldn't have prepared a duplicate. Also true, Merida giggled. Now, normally our producers only allow tricks that can be evaluated, Pen said to the audience. However, this was one trick that they simply couldn't evaluate. They've told us that Merida could replicate the trick over and over again, but evaluation was simply impossible. He turned and looked at Merida. Normally, we don't ask a magician to reveal their tricks, but, Merida, could you at least give us a hint as to how it's done? Merida gave a Cheshire grin as she stared at Pen and Teller. Magic. The answer was simple, but it brought a smile and a laugh to the audience. Pen and Teller just laughed, stood, and applauded. The audience joined in the applause, and Merida took a bow before turning and walking off the stage.